Welcome back to Bible in a Year. I'm so glad that you're here. This week we're working on 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Paul of Tarsus wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians around 56 to 57 AD, and he wrote them to the Christian church at Corinth. Paul had visited Corinth several years earlier, like 50 to 52. He had gotten the Corinthian congregation going. He had had lots of converts, both from Judaism and from paganism, the Gentiles. And he had spent about 2 years there, and he was pretty close to the Corinthians. Corinth was a prosperous merchant city on an important trade route between Asia and Western Europe. It also had a widespread reputation for sexual immorality throughout the ancient world. In Paul's letters, this was because of all of the fertility cults that they had at Corinth. And Paul's letter to the Christians at Corinth addressed his concern over the rampant immorality that is associated with the fertility religions at Corinth, and immorality that had begun to affect the Corinthian congregation. Paul was deeply concerned for the health of the Corinthian congregation, so consequently he corresponded more with the Corinthians than with any of the other congregations that he established. The New Testament preserves 2 of these letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but the internal evidence suggests that he wrote at least 4 letters. Let me show you the internal evidence. First, if you look up 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, that's 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. It refers to an earlier letter that was warning about sexual immorality. And this is sometimes called the warning letter. So there was an earlier warning letter. And then Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. And the big thing he's doing in 1 Corinthians is Paul is presenting issues that are troubling to the community at Corinth, and then he's offering ways to fix these issues. He's encouraging the Corinthians to become imitators of Jesus and to follow in the way of Christ. So there's the earlier letter that's referred to in 1 Corinthians 5:9. Then there's 1 Corinthians itself. And then there is the severe letter. Paul refers to an earlier letter of tears in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 3 to 4 and 7 to 8. Well, 1 Corinthians doesn't match this description of the letter of tears. So the letter of tears may have been written between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And then Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. So first he wrote the warning letter, then he wrote 1 Corinthians, then he wrote the letter of tears, then he wrote 2 Corinthians. Now, some people have suggested that the letter of tears could be contained in 2 Corinthians chapters 10 to 13. Some scholars say yes. Some scholars say no. Now, the structure of 1 Corinthians is it starts out with Paul saying hello to the people in a salutation and defending his apostleship that was given him through a revelation from Christ. And then he gives a thanksgiving and introduces the topics of charismata, or the gifts of the Spirit, and gnosis, or knowledge. And he's going to come back to those topics. And then he goes into a section, chapter 1, verse 10 through chapter 4, verse 21, on the divisions that exist in Corinth. He talks about the facts of the division, what it is that's dividing them, the causes of division, and what the cure for division would be in these 4 chapters. And then in chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 20, he talks about the immorality that's going on at Corinth. He calls for discipline of an immoral brother. He calls for resolving their personal disputes. And he calls for sexual purity. And then in chapter 7 through the end of chapter 14, he talks about the difficulties that are going on in Corinth. He talks about what's going on in marriage. He talks about Christian liberty. He talks about worship. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 58, he talks about the whole doctrine of the resurrection. And then he ends in chapter 16. So 1 Corinthians is, Paul is presenting issues that are troubling the community in Corinth, and he's offering ways to fix them. And passages that you're going to be, or chapters, whole chapters, that you're going to be real familiar with in 1 Corinthians would be 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where St. Paul talks about church order. And specifically the reason that you might mention that is because he talks about women being silent in church. We'll talk about that when we get together. 1 Corinthians 13 is the famous love chapter, which you know so well, and a lot of you will have had at your weddings. And that's a beautiful chapter. And of course, we're going to look at chapter 15 on the resurrection. Then in 2 Corinthians, Paul starts it with a greeting. And then in the first 7 chapters, he defends his action and his apostleship, expressing his great affection for the Corinthians. And then in chapters 8 and 9, he's giving instructions for the collection for the poor in the Jerusalem congregation. And then chapter 10 through chapter 13 is a polemic in defense of his apostleship. Then we've got the end in chapter 13. We're going to spend most of our time looking at 1 Corinthians when we get together as a group. But read it, enjoy it, have a good time with it, learn from it, because what's going on in Corinth is always going on in most congregations. Not everything that was going on in Corinth, thank God, but a lot of it. I can remember when I read Diary of a Country Priest for the first time. Just about the first line in that book said, "There's one parish, and every pastor has it." And that is true. And that's one of the reasons why parish pastors love reading about what's going on in Corinthians, because Paul gives such great advice about how to handle problems that have come up. And these are problems that every pastor is going to see several times in his parish. Spiritual elitism is not new. It would be really nice if it had gone the way of all flesh in Corinthians, but no, we always have people who think that they're better Christians than other people in church. Anyway, we'll talk about this in person. What I hope that you'll do is really have fun with this as you're reading it, because Paul is very wise. And this is the Word of God. So let it teach you. And I'll see you in a week. Thanks a lot.